Imagine a world where the blood that runs through your veins is not just a biological fluid, but a sacred bond, a magical connection that ties you to the divine. This was the world of medieval Europe, where kinship was more than just family ties. It was a mystical, spiritual force that shaped every aspect of life. In this world, the line between the natural and the supernatural was blurred, and the bonds of kinship were as much about the spirit as they were about the flesh. Eduardo Viveros de Castro, a renowned anthropologist, argued that kinship is not just about blood and biology. Instead, it is a process of generating similarity and difference, a way of creating and maintaining relationships. He saw kinship as existing in the same realm as gift exchange and animism, where things and people are perceived as persons, and relationships are expressed through kinship terms. In his words, kinship is magic, for magic is kinship. In the medieval world, this idea of kinship as magic was deeply ingrained. The act of giving gifts, for example, was not just a social exchange, but a way of creating and maintaining kinship bonds. When you gave a gift, you were not just transferring an object. You were creating a relationship, a bond of magical influence. This bond was seen as a kinship relation, a way of connecting people and things in a web of social and spiritual significance. But what does this mean for understanding medieval kinship? It means that we cannot simply reduce kinship to biology, or to a nature versus culture dichotomy. Such conceptions are rooted in the modern Western world, and may not apply to medieval Europe. In the Middle Ages, kinship was an expression of divine love, a reflection of the spiritual order of the universe. For medieval people, the world was divided not into nature and culture, but into the spirit and the flesh. The spirit was the realm of the divine, where the bonds of kinship were perfect and uncorrupted. The flesh, on the other hand, was the realm of human existence, where these bonds were subject to the imperfections of the physical world. Even so, the spiritual and the physical were not separate but intertwined, existing in a constant interaction. Take, for example, the concept of spiritual kinship. In the medieval world, spiritual kinship was not a fictive or superimposed form of kinship, but a central aspect of social life. Through rituals like baptism, individuals were spiritually reborn, becoming part of a larger community bound by divine love. This spiritual kinship was seen as a perfect form of the kinship that existed in the physical world, a way of connecting people through the divine. The idea of spiritual kinship was not just a religious concept, it was a way of understanding the world. Medieval people saw their birth families in moral and spiritual terms, recognizing that the bonds of kinship were not just biological but spiritual. This spiritual dimension of kinship was reflected in the way people lived, loved, and interacted with each other. One of the most powerful examples of this is the story of Emperor Louis the Pious and his sons. In 839, at the last assembly in Worms, Louis pleaded with his sons to love one another. He did not assume that their blood relationship would automatically ensure harmony. Instead, he recognized that love was the fundamental force that made kinship binding. This love was not just a human emotion, but an emanation of divine love, as modeled in the teachings of Jesus. The deficit of love, not just among the brothers but among the broader community, was a significant factor in the civil war that followed Louis's death. This story illustrates that kinship, in the medieval world, was not just about blood ties, but about the love and spiritual connection that bound people together. In the modern world, we often speak of the love of community or country, recognizing that laws alone cannot ensure civic engagement and harmony. Similarly, in the medieval world, love was the glue that held society together. It was the force that made kinship meaningful and binding, a reflection of the divine order of the universe. As we delve deeper into the world of medieval kinship, we will explore how these ideas of love, magic, and spiritual connection shaped the social and cultural fabric of the time. We will see how kinship was not just a basic human impulse, but a complex, multifaceted aspect of medieval life, rooted in the spiritual and the divine. When the ancient thinkers talked about the early days of humanity, they focused on simple causes and principles instead of thinking about how humans changed and developed over time. They believed the world was always there, shaped by a divine power, and that human abilities were what led to any changes in society, if you could call them that. These thinkers were more interested in the natural abilities of humans and how they showed up in politics, rather than in how families or social groups formed. Some ancient historians and poets, though, did show a bit of awareness of how things changed over time. For example, Herodotus, an ancient Greek historian, talked about how the Nile Delta formed over a long time, and how some cities that were once strong became weak, and others that were once weak became strong. However, he traced the origins of conflicts in his time back to the legendary Trojan War, and didn't think much about a time before that. In his writings, the Roman poet Horace briefly touched on how humans might have evolved. He said that when humans first appeared, they were wild and fought for food and shelter. Over time, they learned to use words, build walls, and make laws. This idea was later picked up by modern thinkers like Lewis Henry Morgan, who used it to argue that humans started at the bottom and worked their way up, developing language, art, and other aspects of culture. The Epicurean philosopher Lucretius also wrote about human development. He said that early humans lived in a harsh world with dangerous animals and a lack of technology. They gradually learned to use fire, make tools, and speak, which led to the formation of laws and cities. However, he also noted that this progress came with its downsides, like the pursuit of wealth and the rise of religion. In contrast, Hesiod and Ovid, two ancient poets, saw human history as a decline from a golden age. Hesiod said that the first humans were pious and lived without laws, enjoying the earth's bounty. Over time, humans became more sinful and the world worsened. Ovid had a similar view, describing a golden age followed by a series of declining ages, each worse than the last, until the world was almost destroyed by a flood. Only two people, Deucalion and Pyrrha, survived, and they repopulated the world with help from the gods. Plato, in his work Timaeus, focused on the creation of humans by a divine being called the demiurge. He described how humans were given a soul and a body, and how women came from cowardly men. Plato was more interested in the moral and intellectual aspects of human life, rather than in how families or social groups form. In his Laws, Plato tried to imagine the origins of human society. He suggested that a great flood had destroyed most of humanity, leaving only simple mountain dwellers. These survivors slowly moved down from the mountains, forming the first communities. At first, they were simple and honest, living without laws or the need for conflict. As they moved to more fertile lands, they developed agriculture, crafts, and eventually laws and politics. These ancient ideas about human origins and development show that while the ancients did think about how humans changed over time, they often saw it in terms of moral decline or divine intervention rather than a gradual social evolution. In a world of myth and philosophy, the ancient Greeks, particularly Plato and Aristotle, explored the idea of how societies form and function, starting from the very basic unit, the family. Plato used the example of the Cyclopes, giants with a single eye, to describe an early stage of human society. These beings lived in caves, each ruling over their own family without interfering with others. Plato called this type of rule dynasteia, which means arbitrary rule. He saw this as a primitive and somewhat chaotic way of life, but also hinted at a deeper, more divine order. The word themes was used to describe the laws or rules that these cyclopes followed, which were believed to be given by the gods. This idea of divine law was personified by the goddess Themis. Henry Maine, a later scholar, saw the Cyclopes as a representation of an early, simpler form of justice. According to Maine, the Themis of the Cyclopes was a kind of natural law that existed before formal legal systems. He believed that this early form of justice was based on the authority of the family, particularly the father, who was seen as a kind of god in his own home. Maine argued that this was a stage in human development where people lived in small, isolated groups, and the father's commands were seen as divine and absolute. Plato, in his work Laws, expanded on this idea by imagining a scenario where a great flood had destroyed all cities, leaving only families or small clans. These clans were ruled by the eldest, who passed down paternal laws that were believed to be divinely inspired. Over time, these clans came together to form larger communities, and the need for more formal laws became apparent. Wise elders were chosen to create these laws, which helped harmonize the diverse customs and beliefs of the different groups. As these communities grew, they moved from the hills to the plains, and larger cities were founded. Plato used the example of Troy, as described by Homer, to illustrate this transition. In these early cities, different groups brought their own gods and customs, and the challenge was to create a unified set of laws that everyone could follow. Aristotle, another great Greek philosopher, also explored the idea of the family and its role in the larger society. He believed that the household was a microcosm of the city. In his work, Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle discussed different types of friendships, including those within the family. He saw the relationship between a father and son as a form of monarchy, where the father rules with care and affection. The relationship between a husband and wife was more like an aristocracy, where each has a role and both are respected. The relationship between brothers was compared to a timocracy, where there is equality and shared governance. Aristotle also noted that the affection between family members, especially between parents and children, was based on a natural bond. Parents love their children as part of themselves, and children love their parents because they originated from them. This bond was essential for the stability and well-being of the household, which in turn was the foundation of the city. In his Politics, Aristotle further developed the idea that the household was the building block of the city. He believed that the household had two primary functions: reproduction, the union of male and female, and production, the relationship between master and slave. The master, who was typically male, was responsible for making decisions and providing for the family, while the slave provided the labor needed for daily life. Aristotle saw this as a natural hierarchy, where the master's mind and the slave's body worked together for the benefit of the household. Aristotle also discussed the importance of education in the household. He believed that the father's role was crucial in shaping the character of his children. Good fathers would teach their children to be virtuous and obedient, which would benefit both the household and the city. If the entire community could be educated in virtue, it would lead to a better and more harmonious society. For both Plato and Aristotle, the family was not just a private unit, but a fundamental part of the larger political community. By understanding the dynamics of the family, they hoped to create a better and more just society. Plato's ideas about communal living and shared property, and Aristotle's emphasis on the natural hierarchies within the household, were both attempts to address the challenges of creating a well-functioning society. Their insights continue to influence our understanding of family, community, and politics today. In ancient times, people started forming groups to help each other with daily tasks. These groups, called households, were the first building blocks of society. Over time, as families grew, sons and grandsons started their own households, forming clusters of related families. This group of households was called a village. The philosopher Aristotle described this as a colony from the household, meaning a community that grew naturally from a single family. He used the term fellows of the same milk to describe the close ties between these families, emphasizing the bonds of kinship and shared resources. Aristotle believed that this natural progression from household to village was the foundation of more complex societies. He saw the village as a small community where the eldest member, often a patriarch, ruled in a way similar to a king. This idea of leadership through common descent was a key aspect of early political life. Aristotle often referred to Homer's description of the Cyclopes, where each man ruled his family, to illustrate this point. When several villages came together, they formed a city. Unlike villages, cities were not just about meeting daily needs. They aimed for a higher goal, the good life. Aristotle believed that the city was the natural end of human social development. He argued that if smaller social units like the household and village were natural, then the city, being the culmination of these units, must also be natural. He said, "The city is by nature prior to the household and to each one of us taken singly, for the whole is necessarily prior to the part." This means that the city is more important than any individual, because it ensures the well-being of all its citizens. Aristotle also explored the relationships within the household. He divided household members into two groups: the free husband, wife, and children, and the unfree slaves. He spent a lot of time discussing the management of slaves and property, but he also talked about the roles of women and children. According to Aristotle, men naturally held a position of authority over women, similar to how a king rules over his subjects. However, the relationship between a father and his children was more like a king and his people, based on love and respect. Aristotle believed that the city was a reflection of human nature and the divine. He saw the city as an enduring entity that continued beyond the lives of individual citizens, ensuring human happiness and the good life. He thought that the city's existence was a natural and divine necessity, rooted in the inherent human capacity to form and sustain community. Christian thinkers later built on these ideas, especially when they interpreted the Bible. They saw the creation of the world and the first humans, Adam and Eve, as a reflection of the divine plan. Adam and Eve were seen as prefiguring Christ and the church, showing that the community of believers was a fundamental part of God's design from the beginning. The Gospel of Luke records Jesus saying, "If anyone comes to me and does not hate his father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, even his own life, such a person cannot be my disciple." This might seem harsh, but it was meant to emphasize that following Jesus required a deep commitment that sometimes meant setting aside traditional family ties. However, this did not mean rejecting kinship altogether. Instead, it meant redefining family in terms of shared faith and commitment to Christ. In the Gospel of Mark, Jesus also said, "Whoever does the will of God is my brother and sister and mother." This shows that kinship in Christianity was based on shared values and beliefs, not just blood relation. The Apostle Paul further developed this idea in his letter to the Ephesians, where he compared marriage to the relationship between Christ and the church. He wrote, "Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her." This emphasized the deep, sacrificial love that should characterize all relationships, especially those within the community of believers. St. Augustine, in his work, The City of God, explored the idea of kinship and its role in society. He believed that God created humanity from a single person, Adam, to promote unity and harmony. He argued that the bonds of kinship were essential for a harmonious society, and that the prohibition of incest was a way to ensure that love and social bonds were widely distributed. Augustine explained that as the human population grew, the rules against incest helped to expand the network of relationships, making society more interconnected and peaceful. Augustine also discussed the nature of marriage and procreation. He saw marriage as a holy state, but he was troubled by the presence of lust in the act of procreation. He believed that before the fall of Adam and Eve, procreation was a rational and controlled act. After the fall, however, lust became a part of human nature. Despite this, Augustine maintained that marriage and procreation were still divinely ordained, and that the primary purpose of marriage was to create a loving and supportive family. In the end, both Aristotle and Christian thinkers saw kinship and community as essential for human well-being. Whether through the natural progression from household to city, or through the divine plan of a community of believers, the bonds of kinship were seen as the foundation of a harmonious and fulfilling life. In the world of Augustine, family and kinship were seen through the lens of faith. For him, the most important relationship was not with his parents or siblings, but with God. Augustine viewed God as the ultimate father, the church as his mother, and all human beings as part of one big divine family. This perspective deeply influenced how he saw his own family and the world around him. Augustine's story, told in his famous book, The Confessions, starts not with his birth but with God. He opens by praising God, acknowledging that human beings were created for a relationship with the divine. This emphasis on God set the tone for his entire narrative. Even when he talked about his parents, Patricius and Monica, he saw them in the context of his spiritual journey. His father, Patricius, was more interested in worldly success and did not share Augustine's spiritual leaning. This created tension, but it also highlighted the importance of faith in Augustine's life. Monica, on the other hand, was a powerful figure in Augustine's story. She was deeply religious and devoted to her faith, which she tried to pass on to her son. Monica's patience and persistence in praying for Augustine's conversion are a central theme in the Confessions. Despite her husband's lack of interest in religion, Monica remained steadfast in her faith, and her influence on Augustine was profound. She saw the value in Augustine's education, but more importantly, she saw the need for his spiritual growth. Her efforts ultimately paid off when Augustine finally embraced Christianity. Augustine's journey from a life of sin and worldly desires to one of faith and virtue is a central part of the Confessions. He described his early years with a mix of guilt and reflection. He remembered his childhood misdeeds, like stealing pears from a neighbor's tree, and his youthful indulgences, which he now saw as evidence of his fallen nature. His conversion was not just a personal transformation, but a redefinition of his entire understanding of family and community. For Augustine, the true family was not just a biological unit, but a spiritual one. The union of a man and a woman, he believed, was a reflection of the divine order, a seedbed for both human and heavenly society. This view shaped his understanding of relationships, where the love and obedience within the family mirrored the love and obedience owed to God. His mother, Monica, exemplified this ideal, showing that true strength and influence come from faith and dedication to the divine. In the end, Augustine's story is not just a personal journey, but a reflection on the nature of human relationships and their place within a larger, divine plan. His family and the people around him were all part of this larger story, a story of faith, love, and the search for meaning in a world that often seemed chaotic and sinful. Through his confessions, Augustine invites us to see our own lives and relationships in a similar light, to find our place in the divine family, and to seek a deeper understanding of the love and wisdom that guides us all.